Let me first start by asking a question related to what, Mr. Brokoff, what you were saying at the end in terms of being able to measure offsets. Obviously, we want to make sure that whatever is being done meets the kinds of things you're talking about. It's real, it's new, it's additional, it's enforceable, permanent, verifiable, and so on. But we've heard slightly different things as it relates to forestry and reforestation and so on. And so I'm wondering if anyone else on the panel, if Dr. Lebowski, excuse me, and or Mr. or Ms. Wayburn, you were kind of looking over at from the look on your face. I thought maybe there was a little different perspective that you had in terms of measuring as we talk about reforestation and so on. But I wondered if either of you would want to comment about that as verifiable offsets, credible offsets.
I would agree with Mr. Brokoff that these are key issues that have to be addressed, and I think that these have affected how people think about forests and forest emission offsets. However, I think we should draw a distinction between where those uncertainties really exist and where they don't. I was suggesting that there is a distinction between what we have available in the United States in the way of science and systems and good governance that enable the precise measurement, that enable the tracking and verification, that enable the transparency to be able to quantify forest emissions reductions with very high certainty. And indeed, I'd say they have to be. The only way we can create offsets that are fully tradable is to meet those same standards. And I believe we have done that in California because we are now in a pre-compliance market. I do agree that uncertainties in measurement exist in forests that we do not yet understand, and that we may wish to take a different approach for forests where we cannot measure them as accurately as we can in the United States, and use those systems to help build up, if you will, to the science and institutional credibility and governance that will enable the kind of accuracy that we want to see in a full trading market. But I believe that we have every capacity in this country to meet all of those requirements. And indeed, in California's state legislation, AB 32, which sets a cap, all of those requirements, real, additional, permanent, verifiable, and enforceable, are required, and forests are accepted in that regime as offsets.
Do you believe that it is more difficult from an international offset perspective than it is domestically as we're looking at forests and offsets?
I think we need to do both. This is such a critical issue. When we look at the net excess of CO2 in the atmosphere today, between 40 and 50% of that comes from forest loss and degradation.
Sure.
That's both in the tropics and here. So we need to do both. I'm suggesting that we may want to take want to take similar but parallel approaches domestically and globally, so that domestically we have the systems to be fully tradable, to meet those offset criteria, and to do it with all the measurement and verification down to the very precise 0.01 statistical accuracy. And globally we may not be able to meet that, so we might want to have a different system that we look at which has a different kind of discounting approach globally, where what we're really concerned about is not so much that precise measurement on an annual basis and verifying it and visiting it, but we're using, for example, remote sensing to see if those forests are still there or not, and we make direct payments annually to ensure that. And that as we build up the science there, we can have exactly the same kinds of systems, and perhaps that in the US can help inform that globally. But I think we need to do both.
Going back to the monitoring question, I just, first of all, want to concur that absolutely monitoring and verification have to be done and are a key part to ensuring the quality of these offsets. And that's essential for having a robust market where producers can get fair value for their product, and also where the purchasers can have certainty of what they're buying. And you were asking about monitoring in the forestry case versus maybe in terms of some other offsets from agriculture. And one issue here is that for soil carbon, you really have to get into the ground to measure it. Whereas forests can more easily be monitored from space. I'm not a remote sensing expert, but I've been told that there are some ways you can actually get some idea about soil carbon from space. But in the forestry case, this is a lot easier and a lot more precise. So that's one of the reasons why in my testimony we discussed this national accounting system and improved national inventory with a potential provision for over time, if we're not getting all the reductions from the forest sector that we expected, there might be some room for a true-up. Conversely, we might get more than we expected, and then we wouldn't have to worry about that. But the key is that we can do the monitoring from space, and also that it's very important to build a program that over time will gather more and more data and more information, and have the flexibility that as we get this data, we can then improve the program, refine the protocols, and make things better as we go along.
Thank you. To any of the panelists that want to answer, we will be having in front of us a very important work product regarding global warming coming before the Senate in June, a very important piece of legislation, a lot of work, bipartisan, and so on. What would anyone want to speak to how you would improve on this as it relates to offsets? What do you think would be whether it's the number, whether it's percentage that is in the bill right now, or the language in terms of types of offsets? Do you feel that the language, and I know we'll have a substitute or manager's amendment, we'll have to take a look at the final language, but do you feel that the language is in terms of offsets and the kinds of things, whether it be agriculture or forest lands and so on, are broad enough to cover all of the things you're talking about, or do we need to do some work as it relates to the description of the offsets as well? But it would be helpful to know any suggestions that you would have. Yes, Mr. Corneli.
Senator, the comments I'll make are about the bill as it was reported out of EPW. There's certainly a lot of uncertainty about what it's going to look like soon. But the two areas that we think would be improvements in the bill compared to how it was when it came out of EPW would be first to make it clear that when it comes to offsets, that the 15% that was allowed for compliance for international credits would instead be clearly specified that those could be international offsets. A credit being something like what's traded as an emission allowance in the EU, not an offset per se. We think that's very important. And that would in effect convert the bill from 15% to 30% offsets. We also think it's very important that the idea of these avoided tropical or avoided international deforestation tons be a component of the bill, simply because the volume of deforestation that's going on tropically, I did some math, I think it's 100 square miles a day, roughly, of tropical forest that's disappearing and will not come back. It is so huge that that's an opportunity that we just can't lose. It has all these other biodiversity and ecological and international security benefits. And finally, as a buyer, again, we hate to see some really good, cheap stuff go just because people haven't figured out how to weigh it yet. Let's keep it in the bin until we figure out what the scale is, and then let's start buying it pretty quick. So we think those are two things that would be fairly straightforward and improvements over the bill as it was in committee.
Thank you. Others? Yes, Mr. Whitman.
Well, I would like to add one point on the percentage of the offsets that could be coming from the ag and forestry sector. We believe that the current number is too low, that we would like to see unlimited. If this is truly the least cost alternative out there, and we're not looking at this as a permanent solution, but rather a bridge towards the future where we can get technology to come up with solutions for better energy and other changes in our systems that reduce emissions. We would like to see no limits rather than a 15%. Another area that is very important is the issue of the infrastructure you're going to use to implement this. We already have a wonderful infrastructure in USDA that can provide a delivery system that it's been in the business of creating standards, it's been in the business of creating data, it has data out the front line. One of the issues that I see a major concern, and this has happened in the past as we've added new programs like EQIP or CSP, is that we give an existing organization a new mandate and we don't give them any additional resources. We don't provide the educational support so that they can implement that. USDA scientists have been studying models for years, and our organizations have been working very closely with them in testing and refining these models. And there is a huge body of work out there. And in reference to the issue of measuring and monitoring and verification, we share the concerns of others that we must be able to meet the rigor of these rules so that they're good quality. But a crude measure of the right thing is better than a precise measure of the wrong thing. And you're dealing with measuring something that can only be measured over long expanses of time, because we have variables in rotation systems, we have variations in climate where ag offsets, whether it's forestry or soil related, can never be measured by what happens in 1 year. You have to look at long-term trends. Another issue that we have a tendency to do is think that all the answers to our solutions exist in the United States. We have other parts of the world that had been leaders long before us in implementing no-till, that have data and they have research that we can build upon and add to our existing scientific data to get to answers to how to do this measurement process. It's available in Europe, it's available in South America. You have countries that have whole-scale adoption of no-till that are leaps and bounds ahead of the United States in terms of their percentage of adoption. And our no-till organizations are interacting through international networks to tap that information. So I would challenge you in these bills to make sure that we clearly define USDA's role in the definition of these standards, and particularly in the measurement process, that they be given some specific directives. For example, one is no further funding for USDA model until they put that model in layman's language where the user can put their data in without converting to metric information. I recognize their need to publish in their scientific disciplines, but that industry does not understand today who their customer is. No farmer, no politician, no policymaker will stand for sitting there and trying to convert what we produce into metric units and take 3 hours to fill out a data form to test what's happening in sequestration. So these are things that I think the bill could really improve upon.
Great, thank you. Anyone else?
Up to you. Up to you. Okay.
Hi.
Yes, Doctor.
Thank you. Environmental Defense Fund supports the version of the S2191 bill that came out of committee, but we think an improvement, as I've said before, would be to expand the international credit provisions to allow for the reduced deforestation tons. And this is very, very important for the reasons that have already been mentioned, and especially because this opportunity is disappearing as we speak. And if we don't take advantage of it, we'll end up paying for it in two different ways. First, we'll pay higher costs of complying with our climate legislation today. And secondly, by not getting Brazil and other countries on a path of reducing their deforestation emissions, this potentially can make the climate problem worse and have us have to pay more in the future to make up for the damage. So for these reasons, it's very important to include these credits. And I'll also add on the monitoring side that Brazil right now, through its National Space Agency, has on the internet a website where you can see in real time how deforestation is happening across the country. So this can be monitored and verified. Thank you.
Thank you. Yes, Ms. Rayburn?
Well, I recognize that the version of the bill that we've seen has changed markedly. So I'm not going to comment on the bill as it may exist or may not at the moment, but I would like to suggest a couple of things. We would support unlimited offsets with the proviso that we need to have with that integrated accounting. between the offset sectors and the cap sectors. And I bring this up because one of the most effective ways that forests and agriculture can contribute here is through providing sustainable alternative energy. And if what we are doing in the forest sector is providing this woody biomass for energy and eventually for low-carbon transportation fuels, and we're valuing those fuels in the cap, but we're not valuing their production facilities, if you will, the forests and the farms in the cap, we could drive very perverse outcomes. Because if all we do is value the product, but not the resource that's producing it, we push for more product and we don't have to count for the impact here. And we've seen this, unfortunately, in this leakage discussion around corn ethanol. When you look at the whole cycle accounting, corn ethanol doesn't pencil out from a carbon emissions reduction strategy. And so I think that unlimited offsets, I would favor, because I think that as we move the market forward, domestically in this country, particularly because forestry is a global industry, we will pull those markets globally as well. I believe there's something called positive leakage, which is if I do well by doing the right thing, you may also wish to do that too. And so I think that as we look at trying to incorporate unlimited offsets, we need to recognize that we need an integrative accounting between the capped and uncapped sectors so that we don't have perverse outcomes. And the only other item that I'd like to suggest is that recognizing the urgency of halting deforestation in the tropics, we also need to recognize the urgency of harnessing America's energy to restore our own forest carbon banks. The opportunity here, tens of billions of tons in 50 years, an average of, say, 1 billion tons a year, depending upon what price that you want to use, that's going to be adding tens of billions of dollars into this economy for revitalizing rural areas across this country that are forest dependent, for creating new jobs and energy. That is very powerful, and that will generate the kind of support we need in this country to really enact effective legislation.
Thank you. Mr. Brokaw.
Yes, Madam Chair, I would reiterate what Mr. Corneli suggested in terms of recognition of international carbon credits, and in particular credits generated under the Clean Development Mechanism. This is the largest existing regulatory offset program in the world today. There have been some criticisms of the CDM, I think some reasonable ones. But I think the benefits of the United States engaging with the system probably outweigh the risks, and that's a change I would like to see. If I might take a moment to say a few words about the international forest credit notion, and in particular addressing avoided deforestation through offset credits. I think, clearly if we look at the issue of climate change and how we're going to address it, it's critically important to address deforestation globally, not just for climate change mitigation, but for a whole host of environmental concerns. However, if you're looking at an offset crediting approach for deforestation, all the kinds of concerns and criteria I raised in my testimony come up, I think, writ large in many cases. So you have to deal with issues of leakage. If you prevent deforestation in Brazil, you don't want it to simply move to Peru. And it's a global issue. If you look at timber markets today, they're international and global in scope. They rapidly respond to issues of supply and demand. So I think a system like that would have to have a very high participation rate. You would want participation from countries that make up probably 90% or more of global forest coverage. You also need to look at this issue of permanence. If you slow rates of deforestation, it doesn't help if that simply delays the point at which all the forests are gone. So if you're looking at an offset crediting mechanism, you want to make sure that you're crediting against a baseline that actually slows, stops, and reverses deforestation. And I think that's important when we're looking at where you credit against in that kind of system. You also have to have effective monitoring and verification, and I understand that there are others here who are probably more expert on this than I. Talking with my colleagues, I know we have good systems for monitoring forest coverage. I think there are greater uncertainties in terms of measuring the carbon that's actually in the forests, and we may have to improve some of that before you can have quantification levels up to the level of confidence we want for an offset crediting program. Finally, you need to have institutions and governments capable of actually delivering on avoided deforestation and achieving these gains, and doing so in a way that respects community rights. I think to do that, you'll need some capacity building efforts prior to the implementation of this kind of program to get it going. Again, it's critically important to address, but there are a number of ducks that I think you need to get in a row before this kind of program might be viable as an offset program.
Thank you.
If I might.
Yes,
just
quickly, and then I'm going to turn to Senator Crapo. Yes.
The spirit of dialogue here between the limits, the unlimited, and a lot of ducks to get in a row comments here. One idea that may be worth considering in any legislation that might help solve all of those issues is to create a bank, if you will, or a pool of offsets, an offset reserve, much like the old soil bank or the original farm commodity programs in the, of some time ago, where the idea is to really put large amounts of offsets, whether domestic or international, in a reserve, so they would be delivered, they would be realized, the trees would stop being cut down in as many of the rainforest countries as possible, while the quality and verification issues are being worked out. And that pool, instead of being sold to compliance customers like us, people who want to buy offsets to turn in instead of allowances, would be held in reserve and dumped into the market or injected into the market through, say, an auction in response to allowance prices getting too high. And as all of you know, one of the big concerns about S2191 is some of the model runs that show $77 or $200 allowance prices. Well, having a reserve like this, not of allowances, but of actual real offsets whose reductions have already taken place, could be a way to, A, guarantee environmental quality without borrowing from the future, B, assure that prices are stable, and C, solve some of these very real problems while providing ample places for domestic and international offsets to go and to get paid for. So that's a concept that could be worth considering as well.
Thank you very much. Senator Crapo.
Thank you very much, Madam Chairman. Actually, I think you and I were working off the same list. You asked a lot of my questions, but I've still got a lot more. So, first, Mr. Whitman, I'd like to ask you, if you know, I don't know how thoroughly you've studied the specific text of Senate Bill 2191. I want to get to the baseline question, though. The baseline in S2191 is defined as the greenhouse gas flux or carbon stock that would have occurred in the absence of an offset allowance. The question I have is for a farmer like yourself, who is already engaging in a practice that is reducing emissions, such as direct seeding. Would you be eligible for an allowance or an offset under that language?
I think the issue there is, what is the baseline from which we are trying to reduce overall emissions? And if we are using 1990 as the starting point and saying, okay, by some future point in the future, we're going to reduce from 1990, then everything that people have done since 1990 should be given recognition. The reality is that the concerns about additionality and measurement are going to make it very difficult for me to go back and market the carbon that I've sequestered since 1990. If I've no-tilled my farm every year, I'm probably sequestering between 0.5 and 0.75 tons of carbon per year. The problem with not recognizing that is that you create the perverse incentive for someone, in order to be eligible to cash in on this opportunity, you create the wrong incentives to literally plow up soils, start the clock so that you can become a good person. That's the last thing we want to create in our policy structure. So our view on this is that we need to look at the continuation of a practice like no-till, even though you've done it for years, because every year you have incremental sequestration. There is additional good every year that's being added to the pot. It's not done. And we have all kinds of scientific projections that have said there will be some point in the future where we'll reach saturation and we're no longer, and if that's the case, then I should not be eligible to be collecting on an offset because I'm not sequestering incremental carbon. So it's both the issue of incremental sequestration as well as avoided emissions. The minute I turn around till I start emitting, I start sending CO2 up in the atmosphere. And so we need to create a policy that encourages not only adoption by new people of a practice that works, but avoidance of practices going backwards that are going the wrong way.
Thank you. And I know, Ms. Wayburn, you had mentioned additionality as an issue, as well as Mr. Brokoff and probably all of you, but anybody else want to get in on this issue right now? Ms. Wayburn?
Senator Gray, one of the approaches, the approach that we suggested and has been adopted in California is something called regulatory additionality. And what this does is establish a level playing field for everybody. You work from what are existing laws in your state, or in the absence of law, best management practices in your state that are recognized. And whatever you do above what you are required to do by law and that you commit to keeping there qualifies as additional. And that does several things. Number one, it recognizes early actors, people who have been doing an excellent job, and says, thank you for doing that. We will reward you, and other people will then follow. We recognize that the law sets a baseline of common behavior. And so that concept of additionality can happen in this country because we do have a regulatory baseline or a best management practices baseline, which is widely identified.
Thank you. Mr. Brokoff?
Yeah, I think this issue of additionality is probably the most vexing aspect of a carbon offset program and how you approach it. To speak about it conceptually, the idea is essentially you want total emissions under an emissions cap and trade system to be the same whether you have an offset program or whether you don't. When you issue an offset credit, that allows emissions from cap sources to go up. So in order to keep net emissions the same, you have to give credits to reductions that would not have happened if you didn't have a carbon offset program. And if you're giving credits for reductions that occur from activities that someone was going to do anyway, they've been doing for years, it made sense anyway, in effect, you're undermining the integrity of your emissions cap. Now, I realize that creates all kinds of difficulties and problems. I think there are some practical ways to approach additionality. Regulatory additionality may be one component of that. There are probably, in some cases, for some types of projects, you need to go beyond just the regulatory piece of it. But it does become difficult to give credit, even though that may seem unfair, for activities that have been going on for years and would likely continue into the future without an offset program.
Thank you. Anybody else?
Thanks. The point about rewarding people that are already doing the right thing is important in the sense that we definitely don't want to create perverse incentives for people that have been doing the right thing now to not do it in order to then be able to get credits. So it's very important to address this, and there are different ways it could be done, including potentially through using the allowances that have been reserved for the agriculture and forest sector, and there are other options as well. So this is an important issue to deal with. In terms of additionality, there are very detailed guidelines already developed to deal with and calculate baselines for individual projects depending on the type of project and type of activity. In addition to this project level work, we think it's very important to do very good monitoring and accounting of the overall sector to get an idea overall nationally what we're getting, and then be able to use this data to then go back and improve the project level standards and protocols. In terms of the tropical deforestation, what we've been advocating is for the largest emitting tropical countries, there's no indication that deforestation is decreasing. If anything, the recent experience shows that it's going up. So we've been advocating using historic data on deforestation rates over the a historic period, and then crediting national level reductions below these historic rates as our definition of additional. And especially if you look at it at the national scale, you don't have this within country leakage issue. There still is, of course, what Mr. Brokoff alluded to in terms of potential leakage internationally. So, the solution to this is getting at least the biggest emitting countries on board, and creating a process to try to encourage as many other countries to join into the program. Thank you.
Thank you. Mr. Whitman, again, do you and the organizations that you've been working with support the allowance of international forest carbon credits to be utilized in the United States?
Do we?
Yes.
I think our organizations generally would support a combination of domestic and international. And as a massive user of energy and the implications to fertilizer costs and energy costs, it's important, and the consumers that buy our products, not to have economic shocks that they can't stand. So as long as those international projects are verifiable, and I'll recognize the clean development mechanisms that exist, there are those that say if you're going to rely on international projects and they meet those standards, those are tougher than many of the things that we have existing in the U.S. today. So I don't think we should be so concerned about the quality of those if they are only allowing those to qualify that meet those mechanism standards today.
I know an argument has been made that international offsets would be less expensive than domestic offsets. Is that generally agreed? I see yeses and no's, so maybe we ought to, let me ask the question. The question that I'm getting at there is that I guess there are several issues here to weave together. One is if we allow international offsets, should they be capped? If they are allowed and if they are capped, again, should the domestic offsets be capped similarly, or should domestic offsets be treated differently? All in the context of this question as to what kind of an impact on the market price allowance of international offsets would cause. I know that's a very complex question, but would any of the witnesses care to comment on the issue in general there and how we should approach it?
I'd like to just add to what I said on that, because there is a real concern that if we just allow people in the U.S. to go the cheapest place in the world elsewhere and buy low-cost projects, that we will not really affect the emissions reductions that we're trying to achieve. It won't be painful enough. If we have an unlimited cap on domestic offsets, I think we're protecting the opportunities for economic investment in the U.S. first. And maybe to be conservative, we should have some cap on international. But I don't think we should stop with international as long as we make sure that the standards those projects have to meet are as rigorous as anything we would do in the U.S.
Anybody else want to comment on that? Mr. Cornelli?
I think these are very tricky issues, and the insights that are out there, many of them come from modeling exercises that make their own assumptions about the costs of domestic and international offsets. So with the proviso that my view is somewhat informed by these models and that they may be wrong, I'll go ahead and say it looks like the domestic offsets get more expensive more quickly than the international ones. And that means that if you were to rely on domestic offsets to moderate prices, and I think this is consistent with what Mr. Whitman just said, you'd see higher prices for allowances, and they could be so high that the allowance prices themselves could have these effects of causing people to use a lot of natural gas instead of coal in power production, driving up the price of natural gas for consumers and fertilizer and manufacturers. So to avoid that problem, it would probably be useful to allow a fair number of international offsets, especially the ones that are likely to be lower cost, such as the avoided deforestation ones, understanding that those may be more expensive in terms of all the risks and transaction costs that we really don't know about yet. So what that suggests is that if there was a limit on domestic offsets, it might not be hit. If there was a limit on international offsets, it might be hit. The domestic one might not be hit because the market price wouldn't be high enough to turn on all of the domestic ones that are available.
I understand. Yes, Ms. Wayburn?
I think that we just don't know at this juncture which is going to be more or less expensive, and I think one key reason for that is that in our experience doing these projects, we have what we would call an all-in approach. Starting from the beginning, we have paid for the long-term security. We have paid for the monitoring. We have all of those costs built in from the beginning, whereas in many of the CDM projects and the international projects, the initial costs are there, but not the long-term costs. And the question of how much transaction cost that will add over time is at this point unknown. What I would say is in our experience in selling these offsets in a pre-compliance market, so this is where people are counting on these to meet their requirements under law. Our prices are between those of the Chicago Exchange and those in Europe, and they are equal or less than those we're seeing on CDM.
Thank you. Mr. Blasky, quickly, if you...
Yes, quickly. I'll just say that it's important to note that the version of S2191 that came out of committee also has a provision for a carbon market efficiency board that would have various powers, including the power to adjust limits on offsets if appropriate. And some people argue that there should be no offsets. Some people argue there should be unlimited offsets. I think the key thing to keep in mind is that we should have a system of checks and balances where you have very good data and are able to assess, the quality of the offsets over time and have flexibility to, based on this real information and good data, determine, which offsets should be let in, how many should be let in, and be able to have flexibility to do this as the data comes online. And I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you. Madam Chairman, I do have one more
Yes.
question if I could ask it.
You may.
I can't resist asking this question since this is the Forestry Committee.
Yeah.
It deals with forest fires. And the question is, I guess basically, how do you contemplate that we weave in the issue of healthy forests in terms of the context of forest fires into this whole debate? And let me just say a few things, and I'd love to hear statistics or information that any of you have or ideas here, but as I understand it, the record forest fires and rangeland fires that we saw last year caused immense emissions. And in fact, my understanding is the emissions caused by these fires far exceeds that of any other sources of emissions, or at least the transportation sources of emissions that we have in this country. And so it's a huge emission source. Yet there's also a great debate going on as to whether or not we should let fires burn or not in terms of the proper management practices in our forests. So once again, we have an issue where the way we deal with it in the context of global warming raises, to me, a phenomenal set of difficult issues. And I know that's a huge question, but it's got to be one that people have struggled with as we deal with this in the context of forests. Ms. Wayburn, do you want to start out there, or Mr. Whitman?
Well, I think that is an excellent question, and it's one that gets more pointed as we look at what climate change is predicted to do to forests. And I would like to suggest there are several ways to approach it. Number one, the primary incidence of fire is on our public lands, not our private lands. And what I was suggesting in my remarks is that we focus the market and offsets on private lands, not public lands. I think we want to establish a goal for public lands that looks at managing these forests for their greatest adaptation and resilience in climate change because of the increased stress that climate change brings. Now that may in fact mean much more management on these lands than what we have been experiencing in order to reduce those fuel loads, in fact. And so for that long-term environmental gain in re-injecting, if you will, resilience into these forests, we would have increased management to do that. On private lands where the incidence of fire is so much smaller, I think what you're looking at is what is your insurance system? How do you have, it's really a contractual issue that if I have sold you 100 tons of carbon emissions reductions, I've got to guarantee those against all sorts of natural risks. And so in our buy-sell agreement, we need to have a provision for that. And I can tell you that buyers have very, very strong provisions around that. So there's a buffer system there that is required. whether it's individually or whether it's pooled, whether it's government-backed. There's a buffer system. So I think that the question of fire can, in fact, be dealt with, and it needs to be dealt with over the long term, and it particularly needs to be addressed to our public lands to restore resilience and adaptation to these lands.
Thank you. My time's far expired, but Mr. Whitman, if you could be very quick, and then we can get to
Okay,
the...
well, you hit a hot button with me because we manage forests, private forests, and we're right next to publicly managed forests. We plant almost 9,000 trees every year. We selectively log our forests, and when we get done, we have a fully stocked forest. As we try to educate people, and the role that many of us have here are not only managing carbon, but we are trying to educate others on this whole issue. One of the challenges we've had is getting people to see, well, what products do you have to sell in a carbon portfolio market? And just last week, we were engaged in this debate with some foresters. It's like, we want to get into this. What do we have to sell? And I said, you've got 3 different kinds of products. You have reduced emission products, you have avoided emission products, and you have offsets through sequestration. They said, well, what does that mean? Well, here's what this means. By a reduced emissions project would be going to a chipping operation and chipping slash piles instead of lighting a match and sending that carbon into the atmosphere. Now we're producing renewable energy from limbs instead of sending this smoke up in the air and doing no good at all. That's reduced emissions. Avoided emissions is being able to go out and selectively log a forest so that when you do have a fire, it burns a few things on the ground, but it doesn't totally destroy the forest, and it doesn't burn up 8 inches of organic matter and turn your ground sterile. So once people, they put language you can understand at the layman level, they start thinking of all the things we can do. And I think that's a message that we probably haven't talked about enough today, is that we underestimate the potential of our American entrepreneur to create solutions. And if I am allowed to be a prophet for about 30 seconds, I will say that the cost of this whole climate change legislation will never be as bad as what we think it will be. Because American ingenuity will create solutions that we never imagined. Once we educate people on the opportunities of how they can participate and we scare them with the threats of how bad the cost can be, I think we'll see solutions coming out of the woodwork that we never would have imagined.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Senator Klobuchar.
Well, thank you much, Madam Chair, and thank you to all the witnesses. A lot of questions have been asked, but I will forge ahead. You know, I am on the EPW committee and an original sponsor of the co-sponsor of the Lieberman-Warner bill, and I feel strongly that we shouldn't wait a year to act. I was in Greenland last summer and saw the water melting off these humongous icebergs. They call it the canary in the coal mine of climate change. And you have laid out some of the arguments that we've heard, Mr. Whitman, against the bill, and we know there's always changes that we can make to make it better. But what I was most interested in was, let's say, Mr. Cornelli, not just because you have a Minnesota connection, but your testimony and where you freely said that your company produces 7,000 megawatts of electricity from coal-fired power plants, in addition to the natural gas and oil and nuclear plants that you operate, and that you're the 7th largest emitter of CO2. Are people surprised when you go out and speak? Are they surprised to hear you advocating for climate change legislation?
Not so much anymore. We look at this, as many in the utility or power industry do, as fundamentally a problem of technology. When it's free to put carbon in the air, people will do it. Why would you not do something that doesn't cost anything when you're making a business decision, and your competitors are all making business decisions? So we haven't really had any powerful incentive as an industry or as a company to find something else to do that either won't emit the carbon or that will capture it and keep it from going into the atmosphere. And we, like Mr. Whitman, we think that when there is a price signal, and when there's also other complementary policies that will help support the kind of technology development we need, that people will very quickly, engineers at GE, another member of US CAP, General Electric, by the way, at Siemens, another member of US CAP, the companies that make this stuff, the companies that build this stuff, and the companies that buy it and use it will all very, very quickly figure out how to take the carbon out of things like the power sector and how to keep using coal in a way that keeps the carbon out of the atmosphere. And
could you-
so we think that, you know, that's sort of like we're part of the solution. I mean, we're part of the problem. We have to be part of the solution. Policies have to change the technology. I think the same thing applies to the offset business. We have to get a clear signal to use these, the forest sinks, the soil sinks, the avoided greenhouse gas emissions that can't easily be regulated. Get people innovating about those, and the answers will come out of the woodwork, and we'll be surprised at how quickly and effectively we can get there.
Yeah, one of the things I've been noticing is, say, our country developed the wind technology, but now we've been leapfrogged by 2 or 3 other countries in terms of them getting there first, in terms of the number of turbines and what they're doing. And could you talk a little bit more? I know you talked earlier about the urgency of this and the lost investment and the kind of delay that, in fact, what I'm starting to believe is because the people of this country and the entrepreneurs know we're going to do something, they're actually holding back until we do something. Is there some validity to that?
I believe there is. It's very hard to sink a lot of money. A new power plant costs several billions of dollars. A new auto production line probably costs something like that. Engineering a new electric battery so that low carbon or no carbon power plants could provide electricity with zero carbon to transportation, to cars, to consumers' cars, so they wouldn't have to buy $4 gasoline. Those things cost a lot of money, and people will hesitate to spend that kind of money until they know they can get it back in terms of selling goods and services. And so there really is this sort of leashed up demand here. I think what we're, you know, there's a lot of fear about China is the usual sort of suspect about we exporting jobs to China if we regulate CO2. There's another risk.
And how do you respond to that?
Well, there's part of that is that we have to lead in figuring out how to do this so cheap that they want to buy it. But there's another big risk, which is there are many companies in China figuring out how to make low carbon technologies that they can sell here. And there is a global race in terms of decarbonizing, inventing, innovation. And America is the greatest economy in the world, the greatest source of innovation and creative thinking in the world. As soon as we get a market system that will turn that on for solving carbon stuff, we will win that race. But if we wait too long, and other countries get ahead of us in the race to low carbon technologies.
Does anyone else want to respond? Thank you. To the China argument that we often hear. Mr. Whitman?
I have a concern, and this is fed to me constantly with my children who are much better educated than I am, that we spend too much time blaming China and India for being a part of the problem, when in fact, we need to look at our consumptive patterns in the U.S. and the fact that they simply want to grow the right to build their eating habits and standard of living like we have. We are the model. And if we had everybody in this room go through the process of doing a carbon footprint, and we start studying the impact that we have on global resources, I don't think there's a single person in here who would not change some behavior tomorrow. But it's the first step in changing and correcting a problem is understanding, creating an awareness of how you are personally part of that problem, whether you're an individual or whether you're a business. And we're not going to change China and India's demand for resources. They don't use a fraction of what we use yet. And their growth is increasing, but the level per person is nowhere close to the United States. So I agree with the concept that we go back to becoming world leaders in crafting solutions, making it so successful that they'll want to copy that like they've copied everything else, and that they will follow us in making environmental change.
Thank you. Mr. Brokaw?
Just following up on that and turning the question a slightly different way, if you look at this question of international carbon offsets and the clean development mechanism, this is an offset program clearly we're not participating in, but it has already created opportunities for U.S. companies in developing countries. The United States is actually second only to Japan in terms of being the source of technologies that have been deployed in these energy efficient renewable energy projects in developing countries, including China. So that the benefits and risk can go both ways.
Thank you. I want to follow up with something else, Mr. Brokaw. In your testimony, you talked about the problem with measuring how much additional carbon is stored in the soil with tree plantings and grass plantings, and you said it's difficult to measure whether it's verifiable. I know there were provisions in the 2002 Farm Bill, and we have some similar provisions in the 2007 Farm Bill that require USDA to study the potential for soil carbon sequestration. And could you tell me a little bit about the research that you alluded to, or the lack of research, and where the shortcomings are, and what do you see as the highest research priorities going forward?
Well, let me try to clarify my argument a bit. I'm not arguing that we don't have the technology or the scientific knowledge to verify with some accuracy the carbon that's sequestered in soils or trees. I think you can deploy methods that do that with a high degree of accuracy. However, it's harder to do than it is for certain types of other projects that could be used as offsets. So if you're talking about landfill methane, for example, you capture methane coming out of the landfill and run it through a flare or use it to generate electricity, you can measure how much methane you're capturing with a flow meter with a high degree of accuracy, low cost. Turn to something like soil carbon sequestration, and the methods you use to try to get to that same level of accuracy entail a lot more cost, relatively speaking. So it's a relative argument. And the issue basically boils down to there being more kinds of overhead costs like that for many of these kinds of agriculture and forestry projects than for other types of projects.
Thank you. Any thoughts on hybrid trees? I visit all 87 counties in my state every year, and my most memorable visit to Crookston recently was at the highest tree in Crookston was only like 8 years old or something. It was a hybrid poplar in the back of Wendell Peterson's yard. And so, Ms. Wayburn, do you have any thoughts on that and the development of that, and if that's a possibility as we look into, more trees and more forests, and how we could handle these things in terms of the global warming issue?
I think agricultural approaches to forestry make a lot of sense. But I think at the same time, we want to recognize the role of managing our natural forests effectively as well, and that those gains perhaps are more sustainable, and they're certainly more realizable in the near term. I had my hand up just to offer an anecdote of how we can positively affect China through what we've done in California with forests. Now in Fujian province in China, they are looking at natural forest management as a tool in their own carbon emissions reductions, as opposed to what they have been looking at before, which was a very intensive industrial forest management policy. And looking at the net gains that they were making in climate through natural forest management and meeting their timber and product supply needs. So that was a positive leakage example of developing something here and using it and having it work in China. So I would support that. But the notion of, can we use hybrids? Can we use genetic modification? Can we use fertilizers? All very much more agricultural approaches in forestry. I think the answer is yes. We just need to look at the total carbon budget and what the side effects are. Because if we're going to look at things like crop switching, which is what I would suggest hybrid poplar might well be, that might make more sense than, for example, something like cotton.
Okay. Any other thoughts? All right. Well, thank you very much. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you very much to each of our panelists. I think have exhausted our time today, but we've learned a lot, and I appreciate very much your comments as we explore ways to be able to use offsets in a way that is measurable, quality, permanent, all of the things that we've talked about today, to really be able to allow us to expand upon the effectiveness of cap and trade program. And I appreciate all of the ideas as well. I think it's an exciting time for us. There's a lot of work to do, coming from a state that is not only a great agriculture and forestry state, but we're proud of making automobiles, you may have heard, and manufacturing, and so there's lots of pieces of this. And I have to say, on a side note, that in addition to working on this issue and on the Farm Bill, which is very important in terms of the energy and conservation provisions, we also have a budget resolution on the floor that we hope to be voting on this evening or tomorrow that has a Green Collar Jobs Initiative with new dollars in it for advanced battery technology and conservation and energy efficiency and other areas that are very important, and tax provisions that we have been trying very hard to get past a filibuster to be able to incentivize a number of different technologies that need to be happening. Coming from that manufacturing state, I have to say, though, just a note on China and our Asian neighbors, and that is that they are rushing on technology. When the first Ford Escape hybrid was placed into the marketplace, and we're very proud of the first hybrid SUV, they couldn't find a battery in the United States. They had to buy it from Japan. So the budget resolution that we have that includes an aggressive amount of money, new investment in advanced battery technology is critical, because China is spending hundreds of millions of dollars, as is Japan, as is South Korea, and we certainly don't want to be in a position where we go from dependence on foreign oil to dependence on foreign technology. So I think the rush is on, and in addition to all of the issues that deal with what's happening with our forests and open spaces, the rush is on for us to act quickly and effectively, and we thank you very much for your input.